Hello, fellow fiends, and welcome to another episode of Creepy Cases and Spooky Spaces. I am your host, Cassie Opea. As you can see, I'm in front of my awesome fairy lights again because I have fallen in love with them, and they're probably going to be incorporated into every episode from now on. Probably not. However, here they are again. uh, so don't forget that you can catch new episodes of Creepy Cases every Friday. And if you are a subscriber to the Patreon or the anchor.fm podcast webpage, you can get bonus episodes every other Tuesday. Plus, you also get early access to those Friday episodes. You also get an awesome merchandise discount, good for all items in the Wick and Fae store, not only the Creepy Cases, Spooky Spaces merchandise, but also the Wick and Fae candles, which are pretty awesome, if I may say so myself. And you also get some thank you swag items. Follow along on social media, creepycases.spookyspaces. There's a Facebook and Instagram. You can follow the Patreon without actually having to subscribe, although it is appreciated if you do subscribe. And there is also a Pinterest, which is pretty new, so I'm still building it, but definitely follow along for some really cool content that you won't find on the podcast episodes, but also it has all the future news and updates. Like, comment, share, and all that good stuff. If you have a creepy case or a spooky space that you would like to suggest, shoot me an email at creepycases.spookyspaces@gmail.com, and I will definitely add it to my list. Now that we have all of the formalities out of the way, let's get started on this week's episode. So I actually have a very interesting and kind of a frustrating creepy case for you this week. When it happened, it was super publicized, majorly publicized. And there aren't many people who don't know about this case, but there are a lot of misconceptions and a little bit of, I don't want to say wrong information, but just kind of wrong information. There's actually been a couple of books written about it, and also a movie that was released in 1997, directed by Clint Eastwood, starring John Cusack and Kevin Spacey. That might give our creepy case away. However, after doing my research, like I said, there were a lot of inconsistencies with just the timeline, the details. Names were changed, which I kind of understand that. The trial, the aftermath, just a lot of things that I hope to clear up today. But yeah, so let me tell you about it. I say a lot, and I'm really sorry, but I can't help it. My brain works a little faster, so sometimes my mouth has to catch up. So it's the early hours of May 2nd, 1981 at the Mercer House in Savannah, Georgia. Yes, we're going with that case. An argument breaks out between two men, Jim Williams, an antiques dealer and restorer, and his assistant, Danny Hansford. Now, it was known that these two men actually had become romantically involved, and at some point, the argument turned pretty vicious. Now, according to the original report, the two had kind of been arguing on and off all day, and after separating in an attempt to cool down, Danny showed back up at Mercer House and knocked over an 18th century grandfather clock that Jim had in his foyer of the home. He then stormed into the study where his lover was reading a book, pulled a gun, and fired. But the gun jammed. It was then that Jim pulled out his own firearm from his desk and shot Danny multiple times. He ended up dying at the scene. Now, after 4 trials over the next 8 years, Williams was found not guilty. But was the shooting self-defense or cold-blooded murder. This is the creepy case of the shooting of Danny Hansford. Now, as you know, if you have been a listener of the podcast, I like to focus on telling the victim's story when I do episodes like this. And unfortunately, I couldn't really find that much on Danny Hansford. I know that he was born Danny Lewis Hansford in Savannah, Georgia, to Emily Bannister on March 1st, 1960. And he was one of three sons, having two brothers, John and William. Now, Danny had a pretty rough life early on and fell victim to drugs and alcohol to cope. And at a young age, and I mean a very young age, he turned to sex worker as his trade and his profession. He actually became the most sought out male escort in the area in the late 70s to early 80s. And he was known for his muscular build by both male and female clients. He was often seen in his trademark white t-shirt and jeans. Now, Danny had met Jim Williams at one of Williams's lavish parties that he threw at his home, the Mercer House, for anybody who was anybody. Now, Jim Williams was born James Arthur Williams on December 11th, 1930 in Gordon, Georgia, to Arthur Koslar and Blanche Brooks Williams. And he actually moved to Savannah when he became a noted antiques dealer and historic preservationist. He was active in the renovation of the historic Savannah area. Now, in 1955, at the age of 24, he purchased and restored his first three buildings on East Congress Street. And over the next 35 years, he would go on to restore more than 50 buildings in the area. In 1969, he purchased the Mercer House. And the Mercer House, if that name sounds familiar, it was actually built by Johnny Mercer's great-great-grandfather. And Johnny Mercer was famous for writing the lyrics, and he actually composed some of the music for the songs for, it was over like 50 songs. And I'm sure that you know some of his most popular hits, like Jeepers Creepers, P.S. I Love You, which I absolutely adore that song. It's an amazing song. That Old Black Magic, and Moon River from Breakfast at Tiffany's. He was a phenomenal lyricist and composer. But Johnny never actually lived in the Mercer House, and it had actually sat empty for almost a decade before Jim Williams purchased it. And the last owners were a Shriners Club. But for some reason, there were a couple of people in town who weren't actually happy that he decided to keep it and make it his own residence. But in my opinion, he bought it. He spent around 2 years restoring the home. So I would say that he definitely earned it. So that's my opinion on that. Now, Danny and Jim actually began a semi-secret, I guess a secret as you could get in a town like Savannah, where everyone basically knew everyone and a lot of people talked. And just like any kind of smaller town, you had a lot of, I don't want to say gossip, because I feel like gossip is really a lot of untrue things that goes around, or things that get misconstrued, or, you know, kind of exaggerated. But you know, so I would just say in a small town where people talk and know your business. But basically, everyone knew that they had a tempestuous relationship that involved frequent quarrels. And Danny was prone to frequent outbursts of rage. Now, their relationship lasted around 2 years before Jim shot and killed Danny. So, in the early hours of May 2nd, 1981, Jim Williams made a phone call to police stating that he had shot his young assistant. When officers arrived at the Mercer house in Monterey Square, they found Danny in the study. He was lying face down with a handgun under his right hand. He had bullet wounds to his chest, his back, and above his right ear. Now, there was also a bullet that had passed through papers on the desk, and fragments of a bullet were embedded in the chair behind the desk. Now, police claimed that they had followed standard procedure at the crime scene to bag Danny's hands so they could be tested for gunpowder residue during the official inspection of the body. But after the initial investigation of the crime scene, police felt that it may have been staged. And Jim Williams was arrested and charged with murder. Now, Superior Court Judge Eugene Gadsden set bail at $25,000, which Jim easily posted. Now, while he was working with his attorneys to craft his defense, Jim was also consulting with a voodoo priestess named Valerie Bowles. And Bowles was very, very much a recluse. She didn't trust many people, which I honestly don't blame her in the slightest. I mean, she wouldn't even let you take her photograph. I believe there's only 2 that exist with outside sources. But she actually let very little people touch her, feeling that if she let you touch her, you could actually curse her or invade her energy, which I'm going to stop letting people that I don't really want to touch me, which that sounds really weird, but the intent is there. But she would often visit Forsyth Park, which is about a block south of the Mercer house. And I actually got to visit this park. It is large. It's beautiful. It's a gorgeous place to just go sit and spend time, whether you're wanting to go just walk the park, whether you're wanting to go sit and read a book. There's a lot of grass. There's a lot of benches. There's a lot of shade. When I was there, they actually had kind of a little farmer's market going on, which I thought was cool. And there were a lot of vendors who would actually just go and sit, and they kind of worked based on tips. Like, they didn't charge for their services. It was just kind of donation and tip based, which I think is really cool. Although it kind of opens you up to free services. But I kind of look at it as, don't be a jerk. If you're going to ask somebody to provide a service, especially if they're offering that service for free, throw them a little bit of money. So Jim Williams actually lived in the Mercer house, as I stated before. So he would visit the park a lot for walks. And somehow he met Valerie one day, but they had a relationship that I'm actually not sure how it sparked up. But he would then give Valerie $20 and she would tell him everything that was going on in the community. And Jim actually valued this. Now, John Berendt tells about Valerie and Jim and how he met them in a Savannah graveyard in his book, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And he tells how there was a spell placed on Spencer Lawton, who was the district attorney who filed the murder charges against Jim. Now, he also wrote that the priestess told Williams, quote, Now, you know how dead time works. Dead time lasts for 1 hour, from half an hour before midnight to half an hour after midnight. The half hour before midnight is for doing good. The half hour after midnight is for doing evil. Seems like we need a little bit of both tonight. So Bowles also told Williams that he must ask Danny Hansford for forgiveness. But the antiques dealer was not really inclined to do so. Now, Williams was brought to trial in early of 1982. And his defense lawyer, Bobby Lee Cook, and Judge George Oliver presided over the trial. And Williams testified that he killed Danny in self-defense. And he said Danny had entered the study drunk and in a foul mood. He said that Danny had thrown him against a door and then knocked over a grandfather clock in the hallway. He said that Danny left the room, but then shortly later came back into the study with a pistol in his hand, firing at him. Now, Williams claimed he pulled his 9mm Luger pistol from his desk and shot Danny. Now, the prosecution alleged that Williams had actually planned Danny's murder, and after shooting him, he staged the scene to make it appear as if he acted out of self-defense. They argued that Williams had fired the second gun at his desk before placing it under Danny's hand. They also pointed out that one of Danny's pants legs was underneath a chair and that dead people don't usually move furniture, which, I can't really argue with that, except I have seen spirits and stuff do things, so, but I'm not taking sides here. Williams had also called police just over half an hour after the incident occurred, so that does look a little suspicious. I guess you could go into shock and take a few minutes before you call, but a half an hour or longer seems a little suspicious. Now, the jury sided with the prosecution, and Williams was sentenced to life in prison, but he appealed, and he made the $100,000 bond that was set. Now, Cook later anonymously received a copy of the police report showing that the arresting officer contradicted himself about a bullet being in the floor, or a bullet hole, being in the floor of the Mercer house. And this was enough to overturn the verdict in January 1983, but a new trial was ordered. Now, while the hole wasn't really necessarily important to the trial, it showed a slip-up in the police's case. So, September 1983, Sonny Saylor took over Jim Williams' defense, telling him to openly talk about his sexuality with the idea that it would show Jim as being forthcoming with information about himself. So Williams was found guilty. Again. He was given a life sentence. Again. And however, in June 1985, the Georgia Supreme Court overturned the conviction. Again. Stating that the sheriff should not have been allowed to testify as an expert. And that would be for obvious reasons. And the prosecutor waited until closing argument to present evidence, which I've said this in cases before. If you have evidence, make it known, show it. A lot of prosecutors and defense teams will use this as a way to let the other side think that they have their case, and then, oh no, here's some surprise evidence. However, a lot of the times that works against them because things like this happen. It becomes a slip up. It becomes, oh, well, you didn't tell us about this, and you didn't even present this during the trial. You presented it at the end of the trial, and well, guess what happens? So, yeah, exactly. Convictions get overturned. So, in the spring of 1987, a third trial was held, resulting in a mistrial because new evidence had been discovered, and it showed Danny's hands were not actually bagged at the crime scene, which means his hands weren't protected, and if there was gunpowder, it could have rubbed off during the moving of his body. So, once again, police foiled their case. During deliberations, though, a juror supposedly called a paramedic and was asking questions. And although this was never proven, that is still a very big no-no. When you are sitting on a jury, you are not supposed to have any contact with the outside world, and if you do not discuss the elements of the case. Now, another juror insisted that she saw reasonable doubt and would not budge on changing her verdict. So, June 9th, 1987, with 11-1 leaning guilty, it resulted in a hung jury. So, for the fourth trial, the defense argued that Williams would not get a fair trial in Savannah, and that made a lot of sense due to the case being so high profile. There was a lot of media surrounding it. There was a lot of just different details, inconsistencies, misunderstandings, misinformation. So they requested that the trial be moved, and it was granted. So the fourth trial was held in Augusta. And this actually set a new record because no one had ever been tried for the same crime 4 times, or even, I think, that just 4 times. In May of 1989, after 8 years, 4 trials, it only took 1 hour of deliberation for the jury to return a verdict for Jim Williams. And that verdict was not guilty, and it made him a free man. However, that freedom was short-lived. In January of 1990, just 8 months after his acquittal, Jim Williams collapsed and died at the age of 59. And he actually died in his study, the same room in which he killed Danny Hansford. Now, both men died with their arms in the same position, and it's called a respiratory clutch, and it's basically when you're clutching your chest. And he is buried in his hometown of Gordon, Georgia, which is 2 hours or so from Savannah. Williams' death was kind of mysterious. A lot of people say that it was just a typical cardiac arrest. And some say that he had pneumonia at the time, but I couldn't confirm or deny that. So, but there is one person who also says that they don't think it was as mysterious as people think, and that's voodoo priestess Valerie Bowles, who all she stated was, the boy did it. And as you know, if you recall, she did tell Jim Williams he needed to ask Danny for, his forgiveness, and Jim Williams didn't do so. So maybe he did have a hand in that. Now, Danny Hansford was just 21 years old when he was shot and killed. He was described as a rambunctious type who had a pretty bad temper, but definitely didn't deserve to be shot and killed. He's buried in a beautiful plot under a tree in Greenwich Cemetery next to his mother. And I actually got to visit his grave, and it's actually a pretty peaceful area. It's not Bonaventure Cemetery like a lot of people tend to think, Also, Jim Williams is not buried in Bonaventure Cemetery, like a lot of people think. Actually, when I was talking about my trip to Savannah, a lot of people stated, oh, make sure you go to Bonaventure because that's where Danny Hansford is buried. That's where Jim Williams is buried. You should check that out. Now, Johnny Mercer is buried in Bonaventure Cemetery, but he's buried under a tree. And it's a beautiful spot. I know that's kind of weird to say, but he had a rough go in his living life, so maybe he is at a little bit of peace in his non-living life. Of course, by this time, he's probably reincarnated and living a completely different life. Now, while there's no question that Jim Williams killed Danny Hansford, the verdict is still out on whether it was self-defense or if it was murder. But comment below what you think. Do you think it was self-defense or do you think that it was murder? I have my feelings on it because I feel like if Danny did storm into the room and shoot at Jim Williams, sure, the gun jammed. However, if he were to get the gun to unjam or maybe the safety was on or something like that, he would still have the opportunity to have shot Jim Williams. Now, do I think Jim Williams should have killed him? No. Shoot to injure and get out. Call the police. Hey, this guy's shooting at me, bombarded, we were arguing, The waiting the half hour, like I stated before, is a little odd. The jeans under the chair, I do think is also a little odd, even though I feel it also depends on the way that he fell. Because if he fell and maybe grabbed the chair and kind of moved it as he went down, I could see it maybe getting caught over his leg. But yeah, so comment below and tell me your thoughts, your feelings. Please keep all comments respectful. Please don't argue about it. If you want to state your case, please state your case, but let's keep it, like I said, let's keep it respectful. But also, on that note, until next crime. Bye. Creepy Cases and Spooky Spaces with Cassie Opea is a Pizza and Pigtails production. All episodes are researched, written, and edited by yours truly. You can find new episodes every Friday, with bonus episodes coming out every other Tuesday. You can find the podcast on your favorite listening platform, or now you can find it on YouTube as well. Don't forget to follow along on social media, creepycases.spookyspaces, for all future news, updates, and maybe some content that you won't find on the podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe so you can get access to bonus content, early access to content, and a couple of little thank you swag. If you'd like to contact me about appearing on a future episode, maybe you would like to suggest your own creepy case or spooky space, or maybe you'd also like to reach out about ad space, you can reach me directly at creepycases.spookyspaces@gmail.com, or feel free to reach out through those social media platforms as well. And, as always, see you next crime.